How did a respected scientist fall into the abyss of moral corruption, turning his research into a weapon for one of the darkest regimes in history? On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. This marked the beginning of the Nazi regime. With his ascent to power, the world witnessed the rise of a totalitarian state, a force that would not only redefine the political landscape, but invade the realms of science and medicine. The Nazis, driven by Hitler's distorted ideology, sought to harness scientific research to fuel their racial policies. Science and medicine were transformed into tools for domination and for extermination. As the Nazi regime tightened its grip on Germany, the medical profession, once a beacon of ethics and healing, became an instrument of terror. Some doctors, allured by the promise of career advancement, willingly embraced the ideals of racial hygiene. But others, like Claus Schilling, a once renowned researcher in tropical medicine, were drawn into a web of unthinkable practices that would haunt humanity for generations to come. A man hailed as a hero of science, Claus Schilling's journey took an unimaginable turn. What could have made this brilliant mind lose his moral compass? Born in Munich in 1871, Claus Schilling was a highly respected doctor and researcher. His early career was marked by notable achievements in malaria research. After earning his medical degree in 1895, Schilling embarked on a path that led him to work in various international settings, including East Africa and Papua New Guinea, where he conducted groundbreaking studies on malaria. By 1905, Schilling had secured a prestigious position as the director of the Tropical Medicine Department at the Robert Koch Institute, one of Germany's leading medical research centers. His career stood as a testament to his dedication and passion for science, earning him admiration for his contributions to the understanding of tropical diseases. However, as Hitler rose to power in the early 1930s, Schilling's focus began to shift. In 1936, at the request of Mussolini's government, he moved to Italy to assist in developing a malaria vaccine, specifically for soldiers ravaged by the disease during the Italian-Ethiopian War. It was here that Schilling's willingness to compromise his ethical standards first began to emerge, setting the stage for his later actions. However, the Italian-Ethiopian War and Mussolini's support for his research marked a pivotal shift in Schilling's career. As he continued his experiments on psychiatric patients with little regard for ethical boundaries, his reputation began to take a darker turn. When World War II broke out in 1939, Schilling's name had already been associated with morally dubious experiments. By 1941, as the Nazi regime intensified its war efforts, he was summoned back to Germany, this time to continue his research in a far more sinister setting, Dachau. Dachau was not just a prison, it became a laboratory for cruelty, where the lines between science and sadism blurred. In 1941, the tide of World War II had begun to turn. The demand for medical breakthroughs to bolster the Nazi war effort grew more desperate. The SS, under Heinrich Himmler's ruthless leadership, turned concentration camps into hellish testing grounds. These were not just for political prisoners or Jews, but for the most horrific medical experiments imaginable. Claus Schilling, now fully aligned with the Nazi regime, was ordered to continue his malaria research at Dachau, a notorious concentration camp in southern Germany. Dachau, established in 1933, was the first of the Nazi concentration camps. It was a place of suffering where political enemies, Jews, and those deemed undesirable were imprisoned, tortured, and often killed. By 1942, Dachau had evolved into something far darker, a hub of sinister scientific experiments. Doctors working under the command of the SS used human beings as test subjects, conducting cruel experiments with no consent. No regard for life, no shred of humanity. Schilling's experiments were no different. Using over 1,000 prisoners, he subjected them to malaria experiments of unimaginable cruelty. Prisoners were deliberately exposed to malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Their bodies became infected with the deadly parasite. The goal, to test experimental treatments on them. Some were given lethal doses of drugs as part of this so-called study. This was science turned into a nightmare. The victims of Claus Schilling's experiments didn't just suffer. They were used as disposable tools in a grotesque attempt to advance Nazi scientific goals. Schilling's malaria experiments were some of the most inhumane to ever be conducted under the guise of science. Prisoners were placed in cages and exposed to malaria-infected mosquitoes for hours on end. After this deliberate exposure, they were treated with experimental drugs, many of which caused excruciating side effects. Some were given massive doses of synthetic anti-malarial drugs, doses so high they resulted in severe poisoning or death. Initially, Schilling used Polish clergy as his primary subjects, later moving on to German priests and other prisoners. One of the most harrowing testimonies came from Reverend Theodore Koch, a victim of these horrific experiments. Koch recalled being forced to hold his hands over mosquito-filled boxes for hours, every single day. In total, more than 1,000 prisoners were used as human guinea pigs in Schilling's malaria experiments. The vast majority suffered severe pain, and between 300 to 400 died from these barbaric trials. The survivors, they were left with permanent disabilities, crippling organ damage, and devastating neurological impairments. Among the prisoners, Schilling became infamous, earning the grim nickname Bloody Schilling. When the Allied forces liberated Dachau, they were confronted not just with the horror of the camp, but with the horrifying legacy of Schilling's experiments. April 29th, 1945. American forces arrived at Dachau. What they found was beyond comprehension. More than 30,000 prisoners, emaciated, suffering, many clinging desperately to life. What awaited them was a nightmare. Piles of corpses, survivors in a state of utter despair, and chilling medical records, proof of the unspeakable experiments performed on human beings. Schilling's experiments were among the darkest revelations. His inhumane treatment of prisoners, coupled with the harrowing testimonies of survivors, laid bare the true extent of the atrocities, masquerading as medical research. The liberators stood in shock, forever haunted by the images of men and women reduced to lab rats in a grotesque and twisted pursuit of science. After the war, the Nazi doctors were brought to trial, but did justice truly prevail for the victims of Dachau? In the aftermath of the war, the Allied powers sought to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. One of the most infamous sets of trials took place at Dachau itself. Schilling, along with other Nazi doctors, was arrested and tried for crimes against humanity. The first Dachau trials began on November 15, 1945. They included 40 defendants. Many were charged with conducting medical experiments on prisoners, violating the laws of war, and engaging in war crimes. Schilling's defense was simple. He claimed he was just following orders and that his research was purely scientific. He pleaded tearfully with the court to let him continue his malaria work in prison, claiming it had the potential to save lives. But the court was unsympathetic. Schilling's attempts to portray himself as a dedicated scientist failed. The evidence of his brutal actions was overwhelming. On December 13th, 1945, Claus Schilling was sentenced to death by hanging. Despite appeals from his colleagues who described him as a misunderstood scientist, Schilling's fate was sealed. His execution took place at Landsberg prison on May 28, 1946. He was 74 years old. His final words were, "I am not guilty. Please get it over with." The story of Claus Schilling shows us that unchecked ambition and moral compromise can create monsters even among the most respected scientists. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Enter History. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated with our latest stories. Goodbye, and seeing you next time.